Hi, I'm Alex. I'm 29 now, but the story I'm about to share takes me back to when I was 26, a time when life flipped on its head. I worked as a graphic designer for a mid-tier marketing firm, which wasn't glamorous, but paid the bills. I lived with my parents, Karen and Dave, and my younger sister Mia in a small rundown house. The walls were peeling, the pipes were ancient, and the smell of damp seemed permanent. But it was home. Or so I thought. I was a major contributor to our household, paying for groceries, utilities, and even repairs when things inevitably broke down. Yet appreciation from my family was nowhere to be found. My mom, Karen, had this knack for cutting me down with offhand remarks. Her favorite, "Alex, when are you going to get a real job?" She acted like my work designing marketing campaigns was some kind of hobby. To her, if I wasn't a doctor or a lawyer, it didn't count. My sister, Mia, was no better. At 23, she spent more time curating her Instagram aesthetic than lifting a finger to help around the house. When I'd come home from a long day, exhausted, she'd be sprawled on the couch, scrolling her phone, while the laundry or dishes I hadn't done sat waiting. Any attempt to address this got shrugged off with an eye roll. Despite this, I was cautiously optimistic about my upcoming birthday. It wasn't going to be a blowout or anything, just a small family gathering with cake, something low-key. I even splurged on a fancy cake from a bakery downtown. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd surprise me with a little warmth. Boy, was I wrong. A few days before my birthday, I mentioned the idea of a small celebration to Karen and Dave. "Hey," I said hesitantly, "what do you think about having a little birthday thing this weekend? Just us." Karen didn't even look up from her tablet. "We'll see," she replied flatly. "We might have plans. Plans. On my birthday. I should have seen the warning signs then. But I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just typical Karen being dismissive. When my birthday arrived, I tried to keep the day cheerful. My coworkers surprised me with a small cupcake and sang "Happy Birthday" in the break room. It wasn't much, but it warmed my heart. I even bought myself a new jacket as a little gift. By the time I got home, I was ready to enjoy the evening, even if it was just me and my family. But the second I pulled into the driveway, my stomach dropped. My belongings, boxes, bags, everything I owned, were piled on the lawn. I froze, staring in disbelief. My heart pounded as I rushed toward the porch, hoping there was some mistake. Instead, there stood Karen, Dave, and Mia, looking anything but apologetic. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. Karen stepped forward, her expression cold and detached. "Alex, it's time for you to move out. We've decided you can't stay here anymore. My birthday." They were kicking me out on my birthday. I turned to Dave, searching for some sort of compassion, but he avoided my eyes, shuffling uncomfortably. Mia stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted into that same smug look she always wore when she knew she was untouchable. "But where am I supposed to go?" My voice cracked as the words tumbled out. Karen didn't flinch. "You should have thought about that sooner. It's not our responsibility anymore," Mia chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe if you weren't such a burden." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Me? A burden? I paid the bills, kept this house running, while they spent their days criticizing me. The sheer audacity of it all made my blood boil. "Can I at least take my stuff inside to sort through it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Karen's reply was quick and heartless. "Everything's already packed. You should leave." Tears threatened to spill as I loaded my belongings into my car. I wanted to scream, to ask them how they could do this to me, their own child, on my birthday. But I didn't. I bit my tongue, boxed up my anger, and kept moving. By the time I was done, I turned to look at them one last time. "Why today?" I asked softly. "Why my birthday?" Karen shrugged, her voice devoid of emotion. "Consider it a gift, independence." Her words were like a punch to the gut. I drove away with nowhere to go, eventually landing at a dingy motel with a flickering neon sign. Alone on my birthday, I sat in the tiny room surrounded by hastily packed boxes. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on me like a physical force. That night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I made a vow to myself I would never rely on them again. That night in the motel was the loneliest I'd ever felt. The room was cold, not just physically, but emotionally, like it mirrored the void left by my family's betrayal. I laid there staring at the ceiling, playing the scene over and over in my head. Karen's cold eyes, Dave's silence, Mia's smug grin. I wanted to scream. How could people I'd sacrificed so much for be so heartless? But wallowing wasn't going to fix anything. I had to figure out my next move. The next morning, I woke up stiff from a restless night. My phone buzzed with a text from my boss, Natalie. She wasn't one for small talk, but she noticed everything. And when I didn't clock out of our shared Slack until midnight the night before, she took notice. "Hey Alex, everything okay? You were online late. Let me know if you need to talk." I stared at the screen, debating whether to say anything. On one hand, I didn't want to air my dirty laundry, especially not to my boss. But on the other, Natalie had always been sharp and kind, in her own no-nonsense way. Before I could overthink it, my fingers were typing. Not really. Got kicked out of my house yesterday, staying in a motel right now, just trying to figure things out. Her reply came almost immediately. "That's awful. I'm sorry you're dealing with that. Let me know if there's anything I can do. For now, take care of yourself." I wasn't expecting much more than that. It was nice of her to even check in. But just having someone acknowledge what I was going through gave me a sliver of comfort. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into projects, staying late at the office, volunteering for extra assignments, and taking on freelance gigs to pad my income. It was easier to drown myself in deadlines than to confront the reality of being adrift. But as much as I tried to distract myself, the motel wasn't a sustainable option. The rates were eating into my savings, and living out of boxes was making me feel even more lost. I needed something more permanent. It was Natalie once again, who noticed that something was off. About a week after my birthday, she asked me to stay back after a meeting. "Alex, you've been working like a machine lately," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You're doing incredible work, but you're running yourself ragged. What's going on?" I hesitated. It felt strange to share something so personal with my boss, but the way she asked made it clear she wasn't just being polite. So I told her everything. The birthday eviction, the motel, the feeling of having the rug pulled out from under me. Natalie didn't say anything right away. She just listened, her sharp green eyes softening as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "I have a spare room in my apartment," she said. "It's not fancy, but it's clean, and it's better than a motel. You're welcome to stay there until you get back on your feet." I blinked, stunned. I don't know what to say. "Are you sure?" "Of course, I'm sure," she replied. "I've been in tough spots before, and I had people help me out. I'm just paying it forward." It took me a second to process her generosity. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking a little. "I don't know how to repay you." She waved me off. "You're not repaying me. Just take care of yourself, and maybe get some sleep for once." That weekend, I moved into Natalie's guest room. It was a small space, a twin bed, a desk, and a view of the alley. But it felt like a palace compared to the motel. For the first time in days, I slept without the constant hum of anxiety in the background. Living with Natalie was an adjustment. She was the definition of type A, with labeled containers for everything, and a strict schedule for household chores. But honestly, it was exactly what I needed. Her structure grounded me, and her no-nonsense advice helped me start rebuilding. She also had this way of pushing me to believe in myself. One night, as we sat on her couch with takeout containers scattered around us, she asked, "Have you thought about going freelance full-time? Your side gigs are practically a second job already." I shrugged. "It's crossed my mind, but I don't know. What if I can't make it work?" Natalie arched an eyebrow. "You've been making it work. You're ridiculously talented, Alex. Stop doubting yourself." Her words stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I started treating my freelance work as more than just a side hustle. I updated my portfolio, reached out to old clients, and set up a website. Slowly but surely, the project started rolling in. It wasn't easy. There were nights I stayed up until 2 a.m., juggling deadlines, and mornings where I felt like a zombie at the office. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something for myself, something that no one, not Karen, not Dave, not Mia, could take away from me. Every so often, I'd get this pang of sadness, thinking about my family. Part of me hoped they'd reach out, apologize, try to make amends. But they didn't. The silence from them was as loud as it was telling. Except for one day, life was slowly taking shape again. Living with Natalie gave me the stability I needed, and throwing myself into work provided a much-needed distraction. For once, I wasn't surviving. I was rebuilding. But just as I started to feel like things were finally under control, the past came knocking. Literally. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been working on a freelance project during my lunch break, hyper-focused on perfecting the layout of a client's ad campaign. My phone buzzed on the desk, breaking my flow. I ignored it at first, assuming it was spam, but then it buzzed again and again. Annoyed, I glanced at the screen and froze. It was Mia. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard from her or my parents since the day they threw me out. The silence had been both painful and a relief, like a wound that had been cauterized. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello, Alex?" "Hey." Mia's voice was quiet, hesitant, not at all like the dismissive tone I was used to. "It's been a while." "Yeah, it has," I replied coolly. "What do you want?" There was a pause on her end, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "Look, I know things haven't been great between us, but I need to talk to you about something." I sighed, already feeling the exhaustion creeping in. "Spit it out, Mia. I don't have all day." "It's about Mom and Dad," she said, her voice dropping. "They're not doing well. Dad lost his job a while back, and Mom's spending is out of control. They're in a lot of debt, Alex. Like, a lot." I pinched the bridge of my nose, my frustration mounting. "And what does that have to do with me?" "They need help," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't handle this on my own." I let out a bitter laugh. "So now I'm part of the family again. Funny, because last I checked, you all made it clear I was on my own." "Alex, come on," Mia pleaded. "I know we've had our issues, but they're still our parents." "Were they my parents when they kicked me out on my birthday?" I shot back, the anger I'd been holding on to finally bubbling to the surface. "Were they my parents when they left me with nowhere to go?" "Spare me the guilt trip, Mia." The silence on the other end was deafening, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, okay? I don't know what else to say. I don't know what to do." Something about her tone caught me off guard. This wasn't the usual smug, entitled Mia. She sounded genuinely lost. But even so, the wounds they'd left were still too raw. "I don't know what to tell you, Mia," I said firmly. "You all made your choices. Now you have to deal with the consequences. I can't be your safety net." Before she could respond, I hung up. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, guilt, but most of all, relief. I'd drawn my line in the sand, and I wasn't going to let them cross it. That night, I told Natalie about the call as we sat in the living room. She didn't say much at first, just listened like she always did. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her arms. "You did the right thing," she said. "They put you in an impossible situation. You don't owe them anything." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow, "but it still feels wrong." Natalie gave me a knowing look. "It's natural to feel that way, Alex. They're your family. But just because they're family doesn't mean they have the right to hurt you. You've been through enough." I nodded, trying to absorb her words. But the guilt lingered. I couldn't shake the image of Mia's broken voice. The person I used to be, the person who bent over backward to keep everyone happy, wanted to rush in and fix everything. But that person didn't exist anymore. I couldn't go back to being the one they leaned on while they tore me down. The next few weeks passed without incident. I threw myself into work, determined to focus on my own life. My freelance business was thriving, and for the first time, I started to feel like I might actually be okay. Then, one Friday evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and neither was Natalie. We exchanged a curious glance before I went to answer it. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Karen, Dave, and Mia stood on the porch. They looked disheveled, like they'd been through the ringer. Karen had the same calculating expression she always wore, but there was a hint of desperation in her eyes. Dave avoided my gaze, and Mia looked at the ground, her arms crossed tightly. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Karen didn't waste any time. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, blocking the doorway. "About what?" She gestured toward the apartment. "Can we come in?" "No," I said flatly. "Say what you need to say right here." Karen's lips tightened, but she pressed on. "Alex, we've been struggling. We've lost the house. We have nowhere else to go." My heart clenched at her words, but I didn't let it show. "And you think that's my problem? We're family," she said, her tone sharp. "We took care of you for years. The least you can do is help us now." I felt my anger rising. "You took care of me. Is that what you call kicking me out on my birthday? Throwing my things on the lawn like garbage? Don't stand here and try to rewrite history, Karen." Karen's face hardened. "Don't call me that. I'm your mother." "No, you're not," I said, my voice steady. "A mother doesn't abandon her child when they need her most. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. "You need to leave. Now." Mia finally looked up, her eyes wide with tears. "Alex, please." I said leave, I repeated, cutting her off. "You don't get to waltz back into my life now that you need something." They hesitated for a moment, as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I stood my ground. Finally, Karen huffed and turned to leave, pulling Dave and Mia with her. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. For the first time in years, I felt free. After I shut the door on my family that night, I sat down on the couch, staring at the floor, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still shaking, my chest tight. I wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or relief, or maybe all three tangled together. Natalie walked in from the kitchen, holding 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say anything, just handed me a mug and sat down beside me. "You okay?" she asked after a long pause. I nodded slowly, though the truth was, I didn't know how I felt. "They've lost the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They wanted me to take them in." Natalie raised an eyebrow, her expression hard to read. "And what did you say?" "I told them no," I replied, staring into the steam rising from my mug. "I told them to leave." She nodded, her face softening. "Good, that's exactly what you needed to do." "I know," I said, though my voice betrayed the lingering guilt I couldn't quite shake. "But it still feels wrong, like I'm abandoning them." Natalie turned to face me, her tone firm but kind. "Alex, listen to me. They abandoned you first. They didn't care about your well-being when they kicked you out. They didn't think twice about your safety or your future. You've worked your ass off to get to where you are now. You don't owe them anything." Her words were like a balm to the raw wound in my chest. But the ache didn't completely fade. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth settle my nerves. I don't understand how it came to this," I said quietly. "How they could treat me like that and then expect me to save them." Natalie leaned back, crossing her legs. "Some people can't see past their own problems. They'll justify anything to avoid taking responsibility. Your family sounds like they're in that camp." I nodded, though it didn't make it hurt any less. "I just want to move on," I said, my voice heavy. "I'm tired of carrying this around." Natalie placed a hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, Alex. You're already moving forward. Don't let them drag you back." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my work even harder. My freelance business was booming, and I was starting to get recognition from bigger clients. I upgraded my equipment, invested in new software, and even started saving for my own place. Living with Natalie had been a blessing, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. It was time to start building something of my own. But my family wasn't done trying to pull me back. One evening, as I was sketching out ideas for a new campaign, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hello, Alex, it's Dad." His voice was low, almost hesitant, and for a moment, I didn't recognize it. I took a deep breath, already bracing myself. "What do you want?" "I'm not calling to argue," he said quickly. I wanted to apologize." That caught me off guard. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. "I know we've treated you terribly," he continued, his voice cracking. "And I know an apology doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry for everything." The sincerity in his voice threw me. I wasn't used to hearing him sound vulnerable. For a moment, I almost believed him. But then he added, "Your mother and Mia, they're just scared. We all are. We've lost everything, Alex. We don't know where to turn." And there it was, the real reason for the call. My stomach twisted as the familiar anger bubbled up. "I'm sorry you're going through that, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "But I can't be the one to fix it. Alex, please." "I can't," I said firmly. "I've worked too hard to get to where I am. I can't go back. I won't." There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. "I understand," he said quietly. I'm sorry." And with that, he hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. Part of me wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was something. A week later, I got an email from my realtor. They'd found the perfect apartment for me. When I went to check it out, I knew immediately it was the one. It was a small but cozy loft with big windows that let in a ton of natural light, perfect for a designer like me. I signed the lease that same day, feeling a surge of pride and excitement. Moving in felt like turning the page on a new chapter. For the first time, I had a space that was truly mine. No one to criticize me, no one to demand more than I could give. Just me and the life I was building from scratch. On my first night in the loft, I sat on the floor with a takeout pizza, staring out at the city lights through the window. I thought about everything I'd been through, my family, the motel, the uncertainty, and felt a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. It had been a hell of a journey, but I'd made it, and I wasn't looking back. Settling into my new loft felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. It wasn't just a place, it was proof that I could survive on my own, thrive even, without my family's approval or interference. Every piece of furniture I picked out, every small decoration I hung on the walls, was a declaration of independence. For the first time, I was building something that was entirely mine. Work was going better than ever. My freelance business had grown so much that I was able to leave my corporate job and go full-time with my own clients. I'd never felt so fulfilled or so free. Sure, there were tough days, late nights, and the occasional difficult client, but the pride I felt in my work outweighed all of it. But like clockwork, my family came back into the picture. This time, it was Karen. It started with a letter, handwritten and mailed to my loft. Seeing her familiar scrawl on the envelope sent a chill through me. I debated whether to even open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the message was short, but it hit hard. "Alex, we've lost everything. The house, the savings, gone. Your father and Mia are staying with relatives, but I have nowhere to go. I'm sorry for everything I've done. Please, just help me this once. Mom." I sat on the couch, holding the letter in my hands, my mind spinning. It was different from the last time she'd reached out. There was no entitlement, no manipulation, just desperation. For a moment, I felt the old pull of guilt, the urge to swoop in and fix things. But then I remembered all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, the cold silence of the motel, the way they'd discarded me like I was nothing. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I called Mike, my lawyer friend, to get his take. I read him the letter over the phone, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she's being sincere?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "It feels different, but I can't ignore everything that's happened." "Then don't," he said simply. "It's okay to protect yourself. You don't owe her or anyone anything. But if you do decide to help, set boundaries. Clear, firm boundaries." I thanked him for his advice and spent the rest of the day mulling it over. By the time the sun set, I'd made my decision. A week later, I met Karen at a coffee shop. It was the first time I'd seen her since the night I'd kicked them off my porch. She looked older, more tired. The confidence that once radiated from her was gone, replaced by something fragile. "Alex," she said when I walked in, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and sat down across from her. "Hi, Mom." For a moment, neither of us spoke. She fiddled with the edge of her napkin, avoiding my gaze. "Thank you for meeting me," she finally said. "I didn't know if you would." I folded my hands on the table. I wasn't sure either, but I needed to hear what you had to say. She took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. For everything. For kicking you out. For treating you the way I did. I don't have an excuse. I was wrong. We all were." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I kept my expression neutral. "Why now? Why are you apologizing now, after all this time?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I have nothing left, Alex. And I realize now how much I took you for granted. How much we all did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I don't know where else to turn." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully. "But I can't be the solution to your problems. Not after everything that's happened." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost wavered. But then I reminded myself of all the times I'd sacrificed for her, for them, and how little they'd cared in return. "What I can do," I added, "is help you find resources, shelters, financial counselors, whatever you need to get back on your feet. But I can't let you into my life like that again. Not after what you did." Her tears spilled over, and she nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve anything from you. Thank you for even meeting me." We talked a bit more, mostly about logistics, the practicalities of getting her help. I kept my boundaries firm, but offered what I could within those limits. When we parted ways, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, relief, closure. That meeting marked the last major interaction I had with my family. I stuck to my boundaries, helping Karen from a distance, but keeping my life separate. Slowly, the guilt began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. In the months that followed, my freelance business flourished. I started collaborating with larger companies, even landing a few dream projects that I never would have thought possible a year ago. My loft transformed into a home, a place filled with light, art, and a sense of safety I hadn't felt in years. And most importantly, I began to rebuild my sense of self. For so long, I'd let my family's opinions define me, their judgments weigh me down. But now, for the first time, I felt free to be who I was, without fear or guilt. One evening, as I stood by the window of my loft, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, I thought about everything I'd been through. The pain, the betrayal, the struggle. It had all shaped me, but it didn't define me. I had built something better, something stronger, and it was mine. Finally, I was at peace. Story 2. My parents threw me out at 18 with nothing, is the title of this narrative. They are now homeless and pleading for assistance. However, I turned them off. Hello everybody. Prior to the start of today's video, I need your assistance. One of the best ways you can help us out is to subscribe. As we've observed, the channel is losing some of its popularity. It's simple, free, and helps us continue to provide you with amazing content. Your assistance is greatly appreciated. Together, let's continue to build this channel. Many thanks. Let's begin the video now. Reddit. Hello. I never imagined that I would post details of my private life on this site. However, I need to get this off my chest since I'm reaching my breaking point. I can still clearly recall that day. I was 18, adult in theory, but not in practice. I was completely clueless about my life's purpose. After graduating, I thought I would have the summer to sort things out. Perhaps you should start looking for a part-time work or enroll in a community college or something similar. My parents had other ideas. It began as any ordinary day would. I watched TV while lounging in my pajamas after waking up late. My dad was always up early and home by dinner because he worked in construction. Mom didn't have a job. She was one of those people who, for no apparent reason, spent her days cleaning and appearing flawless. Although my dad did decently, and they were always careful about money. It wasn't like we were wealthy or anything. In any case, my mother called me into the kitchen at approximately 5 o'clock. I assumed she was merely asking me to do a task that I hadn't yet completed. They were both sitting there waiting when I entered. My mom had this strange expression on her face, and my dad had his arms crossed. I was uncomfortable right away. My dad told me to sit down. I took a seat. I felt as though I was summoned to the principal's office. He reclined in his chair as though he were getting comfortable for a dialogue he had mentally practiced. "You're 18 now," he remarked. I blinked. "Yes," as if to confirm something. He nodded. "Now that you're an adult, you must learn how to support yourself." What? I was quite perplexed. My mother jumped right in. "For 18 years, we have taken care of you. That's more than sufficient. It's time for you to make your own decisions." I simply gazed at her, like, what on earth is going on at this moment? Are you throwing me out? With a little crack in my voice, I finally asked. My father shrugged. "It's known as accountability. You can care for yourself now that you're older. Let me now share some information about my parents with you. They weren't violent. They were cold. Even though they didn't hit me or anything, they handled everything like a transaction and were severe and domineering. My father was always complaining about how expensive I was, as if I had debt. He was eager to get rid of my mother. However, she always treated me like a burden, something she had to handle. To them, I wasn't a child. I was a duty. I made an effort to remain composed, but I'm still unemployed. I recently received my degree. Is that your issue?" "My problem," my dad said. The lump in my throat grew larger as I repeated, "How am I going to cover my college rent?" "It will come to you," my father said, utterly unconcerned. "You will have to do it, just as we did." I wanted to argue. I was so taken aback that I just sat there and stared at them, even though I wanted to scream. As if this were the most sensible thing in the world, my mother maintained a neutral expression. She even added, "We're doing this because we love you." In an attempt to sound kind, "You need to learn to be independent." Love? Are you kidding me? That didn't feel like love. It felt like abandonment, wrapped in some weird justification. I tried reasoning with them. "Can I just stay until I find a job? I can help with rent." "No," my dad said firmly. "You have a month to pack your things and leave." That was it. No discussion, no compromise. Just get out. I spent the rest of that night locked in my room. I refrained from crying. I was too shocked for that. I just sat on my bed, staring at the wall. The house I'd lived in my whole life suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. My parents were in the living room, probably watching TV, like nothing had happened. How do you throw your kid out like that and go on with your evening? Like it's normal. I spent the next few weeks scrambling. I had a part-time job at a grocery store, but it barely paid anything. I picked up as many shifts as I could, working late nights and weekends. I applied for loans, but I didn't have much credit history, so the interest rates were brutal. I looked for apartments and quickly realized that everything in my budget was absolute garbage. Eventually, I found a tiny studio on the edge of town. The building was falling apart. The neighbors were loud, and the whole place smelled like mildew. But it was cheap, and that's all I cared about. I signed the lease a week before my deadline and started packing my items. The day I moved out, my parents didn't help me. They didn't even say goodbye. My dad sat on the porch, watching me move box after box to my friend's worn-up automobile. My mom didn't come out of the home at all. I'll never forget that moment. My dad didn't even glance at me when I left. He just sipped his beer and muttered, "Good luck, good luck. Are you serious?" When I moved into that little shabby studio apartment at 18, it seemed like the bottom. I had nothing, no furniture, scarcely any money, and no idea how I was going to make it. That first year was survival mode, plain and simple. I was working part-time at a grocery store, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover rent, food, and bills. I picked up every shift I could. They would give me overnights, weekends, or holidays. Even though my manager was a jerk and didn't like me, he couldn't dispute my dependability. I was there if someone called out. The actual apartment was a shithole. I wish I was being overly dramatic. There were cracks in the walls. More chilly air entered via the windows than was expelled. There was only one setting for the shower, scalding heat or freezing cold. My neighbor on the right smoked a lot of marijuana, while my neighbor on the left enjoyed blasting hard metal at 2 in the morning. The odor permeated my walls. I adapted to it. You sort of have to. The budget did not include furniture. Before I discovered someone on Craigslist selling a beat-up old futon for $10, I spent nearly 2 months sleeping on a blanket on the floor. I didn't care if it smelled strange. Compared to the floor, it was superior. I used an upside-down milk crate for a table and a pile of boxes I had stolen from the grocery store stockroom for my dresser. I became quite skilled at living. Rice, eggs, ramen, and whatever was on sale were cheap foods. I discovered how to add frozen vegetables and soy sauce to quick noodles to make them look like a real dinner. When I wasn't working, I would use my laptop mixer to watch free content as my monthly pleasure. I was attempting to determine how to enter the school. Technology had always been my dream. Even as a child, I had a deep affinity for computers, but I had no one to support me during my costly college years. I was not eligible for many scholarships, and the interest rates on the loans I took out made my stomach turn. I was aware, however, that I couldn't continue to work minimal pay jobs indefinitely. I therefore enrolled in courses at the community college in my area. I would be taking longer to finish because I could only afford part-time, but I reasoned that it was better than nothing. It was cruel to juggle work and study. At 5 a.m., I would awaken to work an 8-hour shift, open the store, and then immediately go to class at night. I would arrive home at around 10 o'clock, exhausted, and yet need to do an assignment or study for an exam. On some evenings, I would simply nod off while still sitting up and using my laptop. I was always exhausted, always under stress, and always broke, but I didn't give up, no matter how awful things got. About a year in, I recall spending a night trying to study while seated on the futon with my textbooks arranged all around me. Since the apartment's heating hardly functioned, and I had the funds for a space heater, it was chilly. I just started giggling while shivering and covered with a blanket and 2 hoodies. I was giggling uncontrollably at how absurd my life had gotten. I believe I was a bit losing it. I considered giving my folks a call. I have no idea why. Every time I thought about it, I thought about that night at the kitchen table, or perhaps I was hoping they had changed or felt bad. They had treated me as though I were only an issue that needed to be resolved. Any desire to reach out was smothered by that memory. They were indifferent. Furthermore, I wasn't going to let them enjoy my failure. Things improved slightly over time. To assist, pay some of my bills, I took a second job delivering deliveries on the weekends. Although I was still overburdened, I was at last able to purchase items like a real bed. I will always remember the day I brought that mattress home. I didn't care that I didn't even have a bed frame yet. It was like winning the lotto just to have a decent place to sleep. I completed my associate's degree. By the time I was 21, I did it, even if it took longer than most. I knew I couldn't stop there, even though I felt pleased of myself. I started at a community college, but I required a bachelor's degree to land a good computer job. I went to a public university, I commuted from my subpar apartment to save money, and it wasn't nice. I didn't care though. To make ends meet, I continued to work 2 jobs. I felt like I was running on fumes most of the time. I take a half-hour nap before driving to class and drink the cheapest coffee I can find at the petrol station. I began excluding many of the folks I knew from high school throughout those years. Our lifestyles were very different, not because I didn't like them. They were partying on the weekends, taking vacations, and receiving parental assistance. None of that resonated with me. I spent my weekends cleaning stock rooms or delivering pizzas. If I claimed that I didn't occasionally feel resentful, I would be lying. I felt envious of those whose parents genuinely desired to assist them. I was envious of those who could concentrate on their studies without having to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. But I also persevered because of that resentment. I needed to prove something, to myself as well as to my parents. I received my bachelor's degree at the age of 24. I can still clearly recall the day I received the email informing me that I had been hired for my first professional job, a junior role at a software business. Stunned, I just sat there looking at my laptop. I felt as though things would finally get better for the first time in years. It seemed unreal to get that first paycheck. I was no longer concerned about my ability to pay for groceries. I didn't have to decide between fixing my automobile and paying my rent. For the first time in my life, I even began saving money. I left that terrible flat and moved into a better one a year later. It was quiet, clean, and comfortable. It wasn't fancy. I purchased furniture, including a table, a couch, and a real bed. I no longer felt like I was merely getting by for the first time. As a matter of fact, I was living by 26. I purchased my first home. It was only a small 2-bedroom apartment, but it was mine. When I initially walked through that door, I felt like I had succeeded. Without anyone's assistance, I created this life out of nothing. None of this was known to my parents. As far as I was concerned, I did not want them to. They simply belonged to my history. Although I didn't despise them, I also didn't give them much thought. When they threw me out, they made their decision. When I made the decision to succeed, nonetheless, I made mine. I didn't hear from my parents for years. No calls, no texts, and no updates from anybody save my aunt's sporadic remarks. As soon as I left their front door, they seemed to be gone from my life. And to be honest, I was okay with that. I was rather comfortable with my life by the time I was 28. I had a steady job in technology, money in the bank, and a house, but I wasn't wealthy or anything. I had saved for years to purchase a modest but comfortable 2-bedroom home. I had already received a promotion at work and was hoping for another one. I had never really experienced life feeling stable before. Then my aunt called me out of the blue. We only spoke sometimes, which made it strange. She would typically check in with me throughout the holidays to see how I was doing. Her voice, however, sounded different this time, as if she were preparing herself. She began, "I thought you should know. The house was lost by your parents." I remained silent at first. It took me entirely by surprise. "What are you saying? Did they lose the house?" At last, I inquired. She let out a sigh. "Your father was involved in a terrible business transaction. He believed he could turn a rapid profit, but it really flopped, as far as I can tell. They confiscated everything once he was sued. Their savings were gone, along with the house and cars." I took a seat back and allowed everything to sink in. Money had always been my dad's obsession. As I was growing up, he would constantly lecture me about saving money, being responsible, and how those who spend money deserve to lose everything. He had now succeeded in losing everything. "Now what are they doing?" I inquired. "For the previous 2 weeks, they have been lodging with some friends." She spoke slowly, as if she was awaiting my response. "However, this is not a long-term scenario. There is nowhere for them to go. Already, I could sense where this was going. They will require assistance. And I considered you." I interrupted her with a quick chuckle. "Me? Why would I assist them?" "Your parents are still with you," she murmured softly. My chest constricted. "Are your parents still with you? When I told folks how they threw me out, I heard the same line 1,000 times. Parents erased what they had done to me with the word. I said bluntly, they didn't care when I needed help. They made up their minds. My aunt remained silent. I believe she was wise enough not to attempt. She paused, then simply sighed. I just wanted to let you know. I attempted to move on with my day after hanging up and shaking my head, but I couldn't get the thought out of my head. I had no sympathy for them, not even close. However, I sensed something. The wrath that had burned out years ago is no longer there. It resembled an odd curiosity more. When I was 18, these individuals had instructed me to sort it out. It was their turn now, and they were clueless on how to proceed. You're excited? Oh, after a few weeks, I heard nothing more about them. I assumed they were still moving between friends' couches or attempting to devise some other ill-conceived scheme. Then I heard someone knock on my door one Saturday morning. I live in a quiet neighborhood, so I wasn't expecting anyone. Knocks are therefore uncommon. I froze as I opened the door. My parents were involved. My dad had a rugged appearance. He was once a large, commanding man, always in control and always towering. He appeared smaller now, as if life had actually worn him down. He had lines on his face. He appeared to have not slept for days, because his clothing were crumpled, and he had circles under his eyes. My mother, who used to be so proud of her flawless appearance, her face was drawn and pale, and her hair, clothes, and cosmetics all appeared unkempt. I just stared at them for a moment. It's probably been more than a decade since I last saw them. We must speak, my father stated in a tight, low voice. I remained silent. I simply leaned against the door frame, with my arms crossed. My mother jumped right in. She shook her voice. The house was lost. There is nowhere for us to go. I cocked my head a bit. Are you acting foolish? Yes, I did hear. Uncomfortably shifting his weight, my dad looked at my mom, as if he wanted her to say the next sentence. She did. Perhaps we could stay here, we thought. Quickly, she said, like I wouldn't notice how crazy it was if she spoke quickly enough. For as long as it takes us to get back on our feet. I was unable to resist. I chuckled. This time, the laugh wasn't even bitter. It was real incredulity. I take it you're kidding, I said. My father's expression tensed. Being on this side of the discussion was unfamiliar to him, requesting assistance rather than issuing commands. He said, "There's no one else we can turn to." He became stiff in his voice. "And now I'm expected to give a damn?" I fired back. "Are we your parents?" He lost his temper. "You owe us." It was astounding how entitled he sounded. He spoke it as if it were a given, as if I owed them something just because they were my parents. A basic rule of life. Are you serious? I shook my head in question. When I was 18, you threw me out with nothing. You didn't give a damn if I went hungry or got a job. For what reason are you here now? Do you think I'll save you? There was nothing we could do. My mother's voice broke as she sobbed. I didn't either. As I spoke, I could feel the years of resentment rising to the surface. When you pushed me out the door, I had no other option. I had to do the math myself, and I did. What gives you the right to enter my life at this point and request assistance? My mother's eyes welled up with tears, but I felt no remorse. Not by any means. Please, she murmured softly. There is nowhere else for us. For a time, I looked at them, trying to determine whether or not I had any pity. I didn't. If anything, witnessing them in this state only confirmed how wise I had been to break off contact with them all those years prior. Before you threw me out, you ought to have considered it. Finally, I said, I am not your fallback option. My dad's cheeks flushed, and I thought for a moment he would yell, but he refrained. He simply looked at me while clenching his jaw. My mother wiped her eyes and looked down. I wish you luck. Flatly, I said. I shut the door in their faces after that. I stood looking at the closed door for a while. I thought I would feel something. I'm sorry, shame, anything. However, I didn't. I was just at ease. They were now dealing with the fallout from the decisions they had taken. After returning to my kitchen and finishing my coffee, I continued with my day. When I closed the door in their faces, I didn't think they would return. I assumed they would understand, but unfortunately, some people are unable to accept rejection. I discovered multiple missed calls when I woke up the following morning. I could tell who they were from without even looking at the caller ID. As I brushed my teeth, my phone buzzed once again. One more call. I let the voicemail go. By midday, after the call ended, the texts began. My mother was the first. "We have nowhere to go. Please. For a few weeks only. We'll leave your hair alone." Next, my father, "You still have us as your parents. You cannot simply abandon us here." Neither of them received a response from me. This fight wasn't something I wanted to have. They were grown-ups, just as I had been when they decided I needed to get my act together at the age of 18. Now it was their turn, yet they continued. My aunt called a few hours later. At first, I chose to ignore it, but when she called again, I decided to answer out of curiosity. I don't want to become involved in this. I could tell right away that she was getting into the thick of things when she began. "Then don't." Flatly, I said. She let out a sigh. "This morning, they arrived at my house. They explained what had transpired to me." "Have they not been sofa hopping for weeks?" I inquired. It didn't surprise me. My aunt had a special place for troubled people. "Yes," she acknowledged, "but finding accommodations is becoming more difficult for them." "I'm unable to call you Laura, as they requested." "No, I cut you off. I'm not doing them any favors," she whispered. "They're your parents." As if there was some sort of power in that phrase. "I don't give a damn," I fired back. When I needed them, they showed no concern. They made it quite evident that I was alone. They are now on their own. "That's reasonable." She let out another sigh, but this time it was distinct. The resignation in her voice was audible to me. "I understand, I do. However, you are aware of their stubbornness. There is no stopping them." "Well," I said, "they'll have to. If necessary, I'll block their numbers." It didn't take me long for things to get heated. On Sunday morning, I received another tap on my door. I didn't even have to open it to know who it was. I didn't bother making small talk this time. With my arms folded, I opened the door and gazed at them. "What aspect of no do you find confusing?" I asked directly. It appeared as though my mother had been crying all night. In contrast, my dad appeared irate. He appeared to be struggling to keep himself together, as seen by his tense jaw and clasped fists at his sides. "We just want to talk," he stated in a tight, quiet voice. I said we had already spoken. "You requested to move in." "No," I replied. "Is there anything more to say?" The voice of my mother broke. "Just listen to us, please," against my better judgment. I closed the door behind me and went outdoors. I was not welcoming them inside, nor did I want them to be standing in my entryway. "All right," I replied. "Speak." My mother was the first to begin. They had been staying with friends, she informed me, how those buddies were becoming impatient, and how they needed assistance to get back on their feet. My father spoke up from time to time, but his remarks were abrasive and defensive. He added, "We're not requesting a handout, just a spot to spend a short time. We'll cover the rent. We'll assist." I waited for them to complete before continuing. "When you expelled me at the age of 18, do you recall what you told me?" They both remained silent. I continued. "I was an adult, you claimed. It's time for me to think things out, you remarked. You showed no concern for my lack of a job, a plan, or a place to go. I had to figure out why you threw me out in the first place. It's your time now. It's unfair." With tears running down her cheeks, my mother whispered, "Unfair." I said it again, louder. "You're correct. It was unfair. It was unfair. I ate instant noodles and slept on the floor of a rundown flat when I was 18 because I couldn't afford to buy real food. When I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, it wasn't fair. But back then, you didn't give a damn about fair. Why should I suddenly give a damn about it?" My father's face flushed. He yelled, "We did what we believed was best for you. You learned how to be self-sufficient from us. I didn't learn anything from you." I fired back. You left me behind. I became a burden. Therefore, you threw me out. Don't pretend that you done me a favor while you're standing here." There was silence for a minute. My dad appeared to be pondering what to say, while my mom just stood there sobbing softly. At last, he said something. He said, "We're your family. You owe us." The final straw was that. I lowered my voice and moved closer to him. "I have nothing to repay you. I came here by myself. Thank you. But no. You want to enter my life now and make me feel like I owe you something? It won't happen, you ungrateful little one." I interrupted my dad before he could finish. "Not grateful." I gave a sour laugh. "What do you know? Thank you. You showed me exactly who you are, and for that I am thankful. It made me realize that I am the only person I can trust. Thank you for that lesson." My mother wiped her eyes, making a final attempt. "Please, there is no one else here." For a long time, I stared at her, hoping to feel something, but all I got was emptiness. The decisions they made had caused me to struggle for years. When I was on the verge of homelessness, they showed no concern. Why should I give a damn now? Your decisions were your own. Silently, I said, "You can now move in with them." I then walked back inside, closing the door behind me as I turned around. I just stood there listening for a while after locking it. I could hear my dad grumbling to himself and my mother crying quietly. A minute later, I heard them back away. That evening, they vanished. With a beer in my hand, I sat on my couch and gazed at the wall. I expected to feel relieved, even victorious, but I just felt worn out. Not at fault, not depressed, simply exhausted, as if the burden I had been bearing for years had finally been lifted. Something dawned on me for the first time. I didn't require their love, acceptance, or excuses. I didn't owe them anything because I had created a life without them. Version 1.0. I assumed that was it. Once I closed the door on my parents that day, they would finally understand what I had to say. I thought they would go on to someone else, but I didn't expect them to fully vanish. Perhaps an old friend, a distant cousin, or someone who feels sorry for them enough to lend a hand. I was mistaken. 3 days or so later, I came home from work to discover an envelope protruding from my mailbox. It wasn't your typical bills or garbage mail. This letter looked official and was quite thick. There was no return address, but my name and address were put on the front. Curious, I picked it up and carried it inside. My stomach dropped as I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. I saw the words at the top of the first page right away, "Notice of Law." I quickly perused the document. With each phrase, my heart beats faster. It came from an attorney, their attorney. In fact, my parents had seen a lawyer. To make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it, I had to read the letter twice. The main idea was this: my parents were saying that I had a legal duty to support them. They mentioned something about filial duty rules, which supposedly exist in some states. Now that they were old and broke, they were attempting to legally coerce my hand. But it was a stretch. It was unbelievable to me. These people's utter insolence. They kicked me out when I was 18 and left me on my own without even calling. And now they were attempting to use a lawyer to guilt-trip me. It seemed unreal. I initially believed it to be a bluff. They couldn't possibly have a case, could they? But I was furious that they even made an attempt. Since I wouldn't allow my parents to crash at my place, I never imagined the day would come when they would try to drag me into a courtroom. I had heard of people utilizing attorneys to litigate for unpaid bills or child support. I mentioned the problem to my lawyer, whom I had previously utilized when I purchased my home. After patiently listening, he instructed me to send him a copy of the letter via email. He gave me a call back a few hours later. "Yes," he said, "don't worry about this. They are attempting to frighten you, but they are helpless. They cannot really compel me to support them because rules pertaining to filial obligation are uncommon, and where they do exist, are quite restricted." I inquired. "No chance," he said. "They would need to demonstrate that they are totally impoverished and that you are able to provide for them. In this case, neither is true. In addition, they left you when you were 18. If a court case ever arose, the room would be filled with laughter." I felt a little more at ease after hearing that. A legal battle did not frighten me. I didn't want to cope with the stress of knowing I was correct. To make it quite obvious that I was not legally required to assist them, my lawyer wrote a formal response and forwarded it to their counsel. Additionally, he stated that I would think about requesting a restraining order if they persisted in harassing me. I didn't object when he suggested that portion, even though it wasn't my idea. After sending the letter, I waited a few days before hearing back from them, so I figured it could have worked. My phone then started exploding once more. It wasn't simply my parents this time. My aunt gave me a call. My cousin gave me a call. Hell, even some unrelated relatives who I hadn't spoken to in a long time chose to comment. It seems that after they had given so much for me, my parents had been telling everyone they knew that I was not going to save them. The worst thing was that some people did choose their side. I hardly know my cousin Mark, but he texted me and said, "Dude, they're your parents. You can't simply abandon them. It's chilly." The urge to hurl my phone across the room was strong. Where were they throughout the 3 years I was eating ramen non-stop? I texted back. When I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, where were they? Why should I care now if they didn't care about me? Mark did not respond. I ignored messages and calls over the next week. I muted everyone else who attempted to reason with me and blocked my parents' numbers entirely. I refused to be coerced into lending a hand by their guilt trip, not with all that they had done. I was browsing through my phone one evening while lounging on my couch when my mother sent me an email. I had also neglected to block her there. The email was far too lengthy. It was a detailed account of how they had fallen on hard times. But it was the same sob story I had heard before. How they were destroyed by my dad's poor choice. How, with no end in sight, they were sleeping in a friend's spare room. This sentence then appeared at the very end of the email for a period. "We have always loved you, even though you may not believe it. What we felt was best for you is what we did." My chest constricted as I sat there looking at that sentence, with fury instead of guilt. "We followed our instincts." They said that all the time, like abandoning me without any prior notice, assistance, or strategy was in some way a loving gesture. I refused to allow them to change the course of history. I did not answer the email. After marking it as spam, I went on. My lawyer called me a few days later to inform me that their counsel had entirely backed off. He said, "They're done." They most likely knew they wouldn't prevail and didn't want to spend any more money on legal bills. That put a stop to it, or so I believed. The entire experience left me with a terrible taste. I began to think of my parents more frequently for the first time in years, about how they treated me as a child and how their decisions forced me to work hard simply to live. It's amusing. When they expelled me, they always pretended to be imparting some significant lesson, but they themselves never gained any knowledge. In particular, my father always thought he was wiser than everyone else, better with cash, more accountable. He had nothing now. We don't always get what we desire from karma. However, this was quite close. Update 2. After that, a few months passed and I heard nothing. At one time, my aunt informed me that my parents had relocated to a modest rental apartment on the other side of town. They had borrowed the deposit money from a buddy. My dad was apparently looking for work again, despite the fact that the case had damaged his reputation. To make a little money, my mom started cleaning houses. When I heard that, I felt nothing. I didn't feel sorry for them, but I also didn't want to hurt them. It was merely information. After telling me, my aunt hesitated, as if she was anticipating my reaction. "I just wanted to let you know," she added cautiously. "Not because I believe you ought to take any action. I just wanted to share it with you." I shifted the topic and thanked her for telling me. Shortly after that talk, I received a tiny gift in the mail one day. I opened it and immediately recognized the sender, even though there was no return address. It contained an old picture of me when I was around 8 or 9 years old. I was carrying a brand new bike and beaming broadly in front of the house where I grew up. My birthday was that day, and I recalled pleading for the bike for months. As I stumbled around the driveway in an attempt to avoid falling, I could briefly hear my parents encouraging me. A handwritten note was hidden below the picture. It wasn't long, only a few sentences written in my mother's sloppy handwriting. "We apologize for all of this. We hope all is okay with you. We simply wanted you to know how proud we are of you. That's all. No pleading, no requesting money, no lengthy justifications. That's all." I looked at the note for a long time, mentally rereading the words. I was unsure of how to interpret it. Perhaps it was real, perhaps it wasn't. For me, it made no difference. But when I thought about them, I didn't feel angry for the first time. I didn't experience many emotions. I reinserted the note and photo into the envelope and placed it in my desk's bottom drawer. I didn't know what else to do with it, not because I wanted to preserve it precisely. I don't give my parents much thought anymore. I continue to work in technology, enjoying the life I've created for myself and saving money for my next home. I've come to terms with what transpired. It was wrong and it wasn't fair. However, it helped shape who I am now. People occasionally ask me whether I feel bad for excluding my parents, and if I regret not being there for them when they needed me. No, is the response. I made my decisions, and they made theirs. Keeping my peace is not a sign of a horrible person. I put too much effort into getting to where I am now to allow somebody to take it away from me. I'm hoping my folks work things out. I do. But I'm not accountable for that. It wasn't. For everyone who has experienced a similar situation, recognize this. It's acceptable to refuse. It's acceptable to prioritize oneself. Refusing to allow those who have harmed you back into your life is not selfish. Peace is something you deserve. Happiness is something you deserve. Furthermore, you owe no one anything at all.